A wealthy businessman received a letter that would change his life forever. The sound of heavy rain pattered against the glass windows as Michael Collins sat alone in his grand office. It was well past midnight, and the usual hum of the city seemed distant. The silence was broken only by the steady ticking of the antique clock on his desk. Michael's hands sifted through a pile of documents, contracts, acquisition reports, and financial statements. His brow furrowed in concentration, but there was a weariness in his eyes that even his wealth couldn't mask. Success had brought him everything he'd ever wanted, yet peace of mind eluded him. As he reached for another folder, his gaze fell on an envelope. Plain white, with no markings, stamps, or sender information. It hadn't been there before. Puzzled, he picked it up, feeling the slight weight of the paper inside. Sliding a finger along the seal, he opened the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of paper. The words were printed in bold black letters. Your success hides the truth. To uncover the cost of your empire, follow these instructions tomorrow at noon, or lose everything you hold dear. Michael stared at the message, the weight of the words sinking in. For a moment, he considered crumpling the note and dismissing it as a prank. But something about the tone, calm, calculated, made his pulse quicken. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his trance. A text message appeared. This is not a joke, Mr. Collins. Check your safe. Michael's heart pounded. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. Crossing the room, he keyed in the code to his private safe. As the door clicked open, he froze. Inside, where his personal belongings should have been, lay a single Polaroid photo. It was of his wife and daughter, smiling on a family vacation years ago. But something was off. Scrawled across the bottom of the picture in red ink were the words, "Time is ticking." Michael Collins leaned against the desk, clutching the photo. His mind raced with questions. Who could have done this? How did they gain access to his safe? Michael was a man who thrived on control. From a young age, he'd clawed his way out of poverty, building an empire, brick by brick. He was known for his shrewd business acumen, making deals that others wouldn't dare to attempt. But beneath the surface, Michael carried wounds that his wealth couldn't heal. His childhood was marked by abandonment, his father walking out when he was 10. That loss had fueled his relentless drive, but it also left him with an insatiable fear of failure. His family, his wife, Sarah, and their teenage daughter, Emily, were his anchor. But his obsession with success had taken its toll on their relationship. Sarah often complained about his absence, and Emily, now 16, had grown distant, finding solace in her own world. As Michael tried to make sense of the letter, another name came to mind. Someone who could be behind this. Years ago, a merger deal had gone south, leaving dozens of employees jobless. One of them had sent threats, but that was years ago, and the matter had been settled, or so he thought. But this was different. The level of precision, the personal touch, it pointed to someone who knew him well. Meanwhile, miles away, the shadowy figure behind the letter watched Michael through a surveillance feed. Their face remained obscured by the dim light of a single desk lamp. A wall of photographs and documents surrounded them, all linked to Michael. The figure leaned back in their chair, a slight smile playing on their lips. "You've had this coming for a long time, Michael," they whispered, their voice laced with bitterness. Michael's hands trembled as he placed the photo back in the safe. He tried to steady his breathing, but the sense of violation was overwhelming. His sanctuary, the one place he thought was impenetrable, had been breached. The clock struck 1 a.m., its chime echoing through the empty office. Michael returned to his desk, pulling out his laptop. He typed in a series of commands, accessing the building's security feed. The footage from earlier that evening revealed nothing unusual, until a flicker caught his eye. At precisely 10:15 p.m., the feed went black for 3 minutes. When it returned, the envelope was on his desk. Michael clenched his fists. Whoever this was, they were not just smart, they were meticulous. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the envelope, now lying on the desk. "Your success hides the truth." The words echoed in his mind. What truth? What could he have done to provoke this level of malice? As he sat there, lost in thought, his phone buzzed again. Another text appeared. "Remember, Mr. Collins, noon tomorrow. The clock is ticking." Michael's jaw tightened. He had no choice but to face whatever was coming. But deep down, a part of him knew. This wasn't just about his business. This was personal. And it was only the beginning. Michael's mind raced as he sat in his office, the weight of the threat hanging over him like a dark cloud. It had been hours since he'd received the ominous letter, and the unease still gnawed at him, an unrelenting presence that he couldn't shake. He had always been a man of control, his business empire, his finances, his life. Every move was calculated, every decision made with purpose. But now, faced with this unknown enemy, that sense of control was slipping through his fingers like sand. Physically, he felt the effects of the tension creeping in. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat loud in his ears as he stared at the photo of his family. Sweat dotted his forehead. His palms were clammy, and despite the late hour, he felt wide awake, adrenaline coursing through his veins. His eyes darted back and forth across the room, scanning for any sign of danger. The quiet of the office only intensified the feeling of isolation. He was alone, with a threat he couldn't understand. He rubbed his temples, trying to block out the thoughts swirling in his mind. Who could it be? He ran through a list of potential enemies, former business partners, competitors, anyone who had a reason to destroy him. But none of their names felt right. None of them had this personal touch, this knowledge of his private life, his family. His thoughts were interrupted by his phone buzzing again. He glanced at the screen, but there was no name, just another anonymous text message. "You're running out of time, Mr. Collins. Remember, noon tomorrow. The clock is ticking." The words seemed to echo in his mind. The clock is ticking. It was a reminder of how out of control he really was. He wasn't used to being at the mercy of anyone, let alone someone who had the power to infiltrate his life so thoroughly. But now, as he stared at the message, the truth sank in. This wasn't just a business threat. This wasn't just about money or power. This was about his family. This was personal. Michael stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with a screech. He paced back and forth in the room, trying to steady his breathing. His mind was flooded with emotions, fear, anger, confusion, but above all, a deep sense of helplessness. He was used to being the one who made the decisions. He was used to controlling every aspect of his life. But right now, he couldn't control this, and that terrified him. His thoughts turned to his wife, Sarah, and his daughter, Emily. The picture of their smiling faces, so innocent, so unaware, kept replaying in his mind. He couldn't allow anything to happen to them. They were everything to him, even though he knew he had neglected them in recent years. The endless work, the late nights, the business deals. He'd always promised he would make it up to them, but had he? He was overwhelmed by guilt. The stress of the situation was taking its toll on him physically as well. His chest felt tight, and his hands shook as he tried to make sense of the situation. The feeling of being watched, of being controlled by an unseen hand, was slowly driving him to the edge. He sat back down at his desk, his mind a blur of emotions and thoughts. He had to act. He couldn't afford to wait around for whatever this person had planned. But what could he do? How did you fight an enemy who knew everything about you? He ran his fingers through his hair, trying to calm his racing thoughts. His phone buzzed again. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the screen. The text was simple, but its implications were chilling. "It's time to face the consequences, Michael." He gritted his teeth. The anxiety, the helplessness, the fear, all of it was intensifying. He had no choice but to follow the instructions. He had to show up at noon tomorrow. But as he sat there, a deep dread settled over him. What awaited him there? What kind of trap had been set? The tension in his body was unbearable. He hadn't felt like this in years, not since his childhood, when his father had left him with nothing but questions. But those memories were distant, buried under years of success and power. Now, however, he was faced with something far worse. His family's safety was at stake. The things he valued most were in jeopardy. Michael knew he had to stay focused. He had to get control of the situation, but every instinct told him to run, to pack up his family and leave. But he couldn't run. He couldn't let whoever was behind this think they had won. No, he had to confront this head-on. He wiped his brow, the sweat trickling down his face. His mind was still spinning, but a decision started to form in his thoughts. Tomorrow, he would go to the location. He would face whatever awaited him. He would find out who was behind this and why. And if it meant putting everything on the line, then so be it. The fear gnawing at him only fueled his determination. He would protect his family, and he would not let this threat define him. But deep down, Michael knew that the coming hours would change everything. His empire, his life, and the fragile balance he had maintained for so long. The clock was ticking, and Michael Collins was running out of time. As the hours ticked down to noon, Michael felt the weight of the impending confrontation growing heavier. The letters, the texts, the cryptic warnings, each one had a deeper impact than he'd first realized. He thought he could outsmart whoever was behind this. But the manipulation was more calculated, more subtle than he had anticipated. The shadowy figure who was orchestrating this entire ordeal had an intimate understanding of his life, his weaknesses, and, most disturbingly, his emotional triggers. The first blow came when Michael received another anonymous message, this time containing a video. It was brief, but the image of his daughter, Emily, walking home from school, looking unaware and innocent, was enough to make his stomach churn. A voice, distorted and cold, followed the footage. "You think you can protect them, Michael? You have no idea how vulnerable they are." The message was a cold reminder of his greatest fear, his family. The very people he'd spent years protecting, yet had failed to truly connect with. The guilt clawed at him, but it was quickly overshadowed by a rising panic. Whoever was behind this wasn't just threatening him. They were using his family as pawns in a game he hadn't even signed up for. The next step in the antagonist's manipulation was more direct. The phone call came at midnight. The voice on the other end was smooth, calm, and eerily familiar. Michael's pulse quickened. He recognized the voice, an old associate, a man named Robert Mason, who had once been a trusted business partner before their falling out years ago. The betrayal had been deep, and it seemed that Robert had never forgiven Michael for it. "I see you're still trying to be the big man, Michael," Robert's voice mocked. "But I have something you can't fix with money. You can't buy your way out of this one." The words hit harder than Michael had expected. Robert wasn't just threatening him. He was playing on Michael's ego. The entire ordeal was designed to undermine his sense of control and superiority. Each message, each encounter, was meant to shake him, to make him question his own strength. And it was working. As Michael prepared for the meeting the next day, Robert's influence became even more pronounced. The text messages didn't stop, but now they were laced with personal insults, reminders of Michael's failures as a husband, a father, a businessman. They weren't just threats anymore. They were emotional punches, carefully crafted to break him down. The voice on the other end would recount in painful detail the moments when Michael had let his family down, missed birthdays, cancelled family vacations, ignored Sarah's pleas for attention. "You think she'll forgive you now? You think Emily will ever trust you again? You're nothing but a failure, Michael, and your family is just collateral damage in your desperate need to hold onto a life that's slipping away." The words stung. They weren't just attacking his decisions, they were attacking his very identity. Michael had built his life on the idea that he could handle anything, that he could fix any problem, overcome any obstacle. But Robert had shattered that illusion. He had found the cracks in Michael's armor and was exploiting them, driving him to the edge. It wasn't just the threats to his family anymore. It was the constant erosion of his confidence. The more Robert pushed, the more Michael began to feel as if his entire world was collapsing around him. The psychological manipulation was relentless, forcing him to question not only his past decisions, but his ability to face the future. The final blow came when Michael received a message containing a photograph of Sarah, his wife, in a vulnerable moment. Her eyes filled with tears as she sat alone in their living room. The text read simply, "You can't protect her. You never could." That was it. The words echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. Robert had crossed the line. Now this was personal. The manipulation had escalated from emotional warfare to a full-on psychological siege, and Michael knew that he had to act, no matter the cost. But even as he prepared to face his enemy, a seed of doubt lingered in his mind. Could he truly win this battle? The days were beginning to blur together, a relentless cycle of unease, confusion, and fear. Michael could feel himself slipping. The weight of the threats, the pressure to protect his family, and the constant barrage of messages and calls from Robert had created a storm of doubt and anxiety within him. Every decision he made felt like it was leading him down a path of no return. He was questioning everything, his choices, his priorities, even his own worth. His every waking moment was consumed by the dilemma. Should he give in to Robert's demands and pay the price for peace? Or should he stand his ground and risk losing everything? The idea of surrendering, of bowing down to someone like Robert, was unthinkable. But the thought of his family being in danger, the possibility of losing them to this nightmare was too much to bear. His mind was a battleground, torn between two opposing forces. As the days passed, Michael's mental and emotional state deteriorated. He couldn't focus on work, and his interactions with Sarah and Emily grew strained. Every time he tried to speak to Sarah about the threats, she looked at him with concern, but he couldn't bring himself to tell her the full extent of what was happening. He had always prided himself on being the protector, but now he felt like he was failing her, failing Emily. The guilt was suffocating. Late one evening, while pacing the floor, Michael received another anonymous email. It contained a photo of him and his family at a vacation home, an innocent family moment captured in a frame. The message, however, was far from innocent. You have one last chance, Michael. Make the right decision, or I'll make it for you. This time, it wasn't just about money. This was a direct threat, a promise that things would escalate even further. Michael's pulse raced as the implications hit him. Robert wasn't just playing a game anymore. He was preparing for something catastrophic. He realized with a sickening jolt that no matter what he did, Robert had him trapped. His decisions were no longer his own. Every move he made was being manipulated, and he couldn't see a way out. Michael stood frozen for a moment, staring at the screen. His hands were trembling, and his mind was reeling. It was as if the walls were closing in, the weight of the world pressing down on him. His mind raced as he thought through the consequences of each choice. Giving in meant losing his dignity, his sense of self, but resisting could cost him everything: his family, his career, his very life. He felt completely trapped. His thoughts were clouded by panic, guilt, and fear. Every answer seemed like the wrong one. He couldn't shake the feeling that Robert was always one step ahead, controlling the narrative and dictating the terms of this game. Just when Michael thought things couldn't get worse, another surprise came. This time, it was a call from Sarah. Her voice was trembling, barely audible over the phone. Michael, there's something you need to see. Emily, she's gone. Michael's heart stopped. His world collapsed into a vacuum of shock and disbelief. What was happening? Had Robert gone that far? Had he taken Emily? His mind couldn't process it. He tried to speak, to ask her for details, but his voice was a distant echo in his own mind. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. It was too late. Robert had crossed the ultimate line. Michael's mind raced as he tried to process the events unfolding around him. The weight of the situation was pushing him to his limits. The constant threat to his family, the mounting pressure from Robert, and his inability to trust anyone were breaking him down, piece by piece. He had always been the type of person who kept his emotions in check, preferring to solve problems with logic and action rather than sentiment. But now, logic seemed futile. The threats, the manipulation, the fear for his family's safety, all of it was eating away at him. His confidence, once unshakable, was slowly crumbling. Every day, Michael woke up to the reality that the life he had built was now under siege, and there was no safe place to retreat. Mentally, he was exhausted. The constant mental gymnastics of trying to anticipate Robert's next move, the incessant worry about whether he was making the right choices, and the fear of losing everything, these were his daily battles. Each decision felt like a risk. Should he pay the ransom? Should he go to the police? Should he try to negotiate with Robert directly? The options were overwhelming, and each one came with its own set of terrifying consequences. But despite the mental turmoil, Michael was determined to find a way out. His first instinct was always to protect his family, and he couldn't let them fall victim to Robert's twisted game. He began gathering information, looking for any weaknesses in Robert's threats, any flaw in his plan. But it wasn't as easy as it sounded. Robert was careful, methodical, and seemed to be always one step ahead. Every time Michael thought he had gained some ground, another curveball would come his way, and he'd be back at square one. Physically, Michael was drained. He hadn't been sleeping properly, his nights filled with restless thoughts of Emily, Sarah, and the ever-looming threat. He could feel the toll it was taking on his body. His shoulders were tense, his jaw clenched at all hours of the day. He could barely eat, and when he did, it was in small mechanical bites. The exhaustion was starting to show in his appearance. Dark circles under his eyes, a paleness to his face. The lines of stress were visible, but the one thing Michael couldn't afford to show was weakness. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. Emotionally, Michael was drowning. The guilt gnawed at him, constantly reminding him that he hadn't done enough to protect his family in the first place. He couldn't stop the intrusive thoughts. What if he had listened to Sarah earlier? What if he had taken the threats more seriously? What if Emily had been safer? His inner voice constantly asked these questions, berating him, making him second-guess every decision he'd made. His self-doubt was suffocating, and yet he couldn't afford to give in to it. His family needed him to stay strong. But strength wasn't just about suppressing fear. It was about making choices in the face of it. Michael knew he had to keep going. He had to find the strength to fight, no matter how hard it became. Every morning, he dragged himself out of bed, determined to do whatever it took to get his daughter back, to keep his wife safe. He would check the house, searching for anything unusual. He would run through possible scenarios in his mind, preparing for every contingency, even though he didn't know what he was up against. Yet, the emotional toll was beginning to show. The smallest things started to trigger his anxiety. He would hear a car outside the house and feel his heart leap into his throat. A knock on the door sent his pulse racing. Even the sight of his phone buzzing would send a wave of dread over him, as if each new message could be a death sentence for his family. He had become hypervigilant, constantly scanning for threats, and in doing so, he was losing touch with the life he had known. It was as though he was living in a nightmare, but he couldn't wake up from it. The struggle wasn't just external, against Robert and the forces working against him, but internal as well. Every time Michael tried to take action, there was a part of him that hesitated, a part of him that was paralyzed by fear of making the wrong move. But at the same time, he knew that inaction could cost him more. His mind was constantly torn between his need to protect and the overwhelming sense of helplessness that clouded his thoughts. Even though he was battling with himself, Michael knew one thing for sure. He couldn't give up. His daughter, his wife, his entire world depended on him. His body and mind were exhausted, but he couldn't afford to stop fighting. His struggle was a reflection of the intensity of the situation. It wasn't just about fighting an external enemy, it was about conquering the fear and doubt within himself. The stakes were higher than ever, and there was no room for failure. But as the days dragged on, Michael couldn't help but feel that the final showdown was looming. an inevitable clash where his decisions and the price he would have to pay would finally come to fruition. And so he pushed forward, even as the weight of the world bore down on him. The storm that had been brewing for weeks had finally hit its peak. Michael stood in the middle of his living room, his heart pounding in his chest. The phone in his hand felt heavier than ever, as if it was a direct link to the final chapter of his nightmare. Robert's voice echoed in his ears, cold and unfeeling. "We have your daughter, Michael. You know what you have to do. If you want her back, you'll do exactly as I say. No cops, no tricks." Michael's fingers trembled as he gripped the phone tighter, trying to suppress the rage and fear building up inside him. He had reached a crossroads, a point where every decision he made would be a matter of life or death. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, emotions crashing like waves, pulling him in different directions. He had promised Emily that he would protect her, and here he was, being forced into a corner. He could hear the fear in his wife Sarah's voice as she begged him to do whatever it took to get their daughter back. But his instincts, his sense of justice, screamed at him to fight back, to end Robert's reign of terror once and for all. But how? He had already tried negotiating. He had already attempted to play by Robert's rules, and now he was left with nothing but a choice that felt like a ticking time bomb. Michael's mind flashed to the last few days. Every moment, every choice had led him here. The fear that had once been in the back of his mind had slowly consumed him, and now the time for hesitation had passed. He had allowed himself to be manipulated, forced into playing Robert's game. But now the rules had changed. He couldn't wait any longer. The sound of footsteps from upstairs interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to see Sarah standing at the top of the stairs. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with worry, but there was a quiet strength in her gaze that hadn't been there before. She had been through hell with him, and yet she hadn't once wavered in her belief that they could get through this together. "Michael, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We need to end this. We need to get our daughter back." Michael looked up at her, the weight of everything bearing down on him. He had spent so much time questioning what he could do, trying to plan his every move. But now the moment of truth had arrived. There was no more time for strategy. The clock was ticking, and every second mattered. His thoughts flashed to Emily, his little girl, the one he had promised to protect. Her voice, filled with innocence and trust, echoed in his mind. He couldn't fail her. Not now. Not when it mattered most. But what if he made the wrong move? What if his next decision was the one that cost him everything? The moment of high emotional intensity hit him with full force as the gravity of his situation sunk in. Every option felt like a gamble, and he couldn't bear the thought of losing Emily. He had to choose. He had to act. No more second-guessing. Then, in the quiet tension of the room, Michael's resolve hardened. He couldn't allow Robert to control his life, or the life of his family any longer. There was no more negotiating, no more playing by the rules. He had to take back control, even if it meant risking everything. He couldn't live with the guilt of letting his daughter slip further away from him. His decision was made in that instant, and with it, the battle lines were drawn. The emotional intensity that had been building for so long finally came to a head. Michael was no longer just fighting for his daughter's life. He was fighting for his own, for his family, and for the future he had promised to protect. In that moment, Michael understood that every decision, every action he had taken up until now, had led to this point. There was no turning back, no escape from the consequences of the choices he had made. The intensity of the moment was overwhelming, and yet Michael felt a strange sense of clarity. The emotional turmoil, the fear, the doubt, they all faded away, replaced by a single focused purpose. His daughter's life was in his hands, and he would do whatever it took to get her back. The conflict, the emotional intensity, was at its peak, and Michael was ready to face whatever came next, no matter the cost. The moment of decision had arrived, and it would change everything. The phone call felt like a death sentence. Michael's entire body trembled as he heard Robert's voice on the other end, now more sinister than ever. But this time, something inside him snapped. The walls he had built around his emotions, the denial he had held onto for so long, crumbled in that single moment. "We have her, Michael. You know what you have to do." It wasn't the first time Robert had made this threat, but this time the urgency, the coldness in his tone felt different. Something had changed, and Michael could feel it in his bones. He knew that the line between life and death had never been thinner. Emily, his daughter, was more than just a pawn in Robert's twisted game. She was his world. And now, he had to choose. He couldn't keep running from the truth any longer. His mind flashed to everything that had led him here. Every choice, every mistake. He had been hesitant to act, unsure of how far he was willing to go. But this was no longer just about strategy. It was about survival. He could keep playing by Robert's rules, keep trying to outsmart him, or he could confront the brutal truth that had been haunting him all along. Robert wasn't just a criminal. He was a monster, one who had destroyed lives for fun. But what if confronting him meant losing everything? What if his actions, his desire to protect Emily, would only lead to more destruction? The decision weighed on him like an anchor, pulling him deeper into an abyss. Michael knew that by making this choice, he would not just be risking his life, but his soul. The man he thought he was, someone who believed in doing things the right way, was slipping away. There was no turning back. His heart raced as he made the call, prepared to face the consequences of a decision that could change everything. This was the point of no return. As Michael hung up the phone, he stood in stunned silence. The air around him felt heavy, suffocating, as if the world itself had paused in disbelief. Everything he had worked for, every hope he had held on to, was about to unravel. He slowly turned and saw Sarah standing in the doorway, her face pale and weary. She had been with him every step of the way, and now the moment of truth had arrived. They had always told themselves they would never go down the path of violence, that they could find another way. But now, standing here in the middle of the storm, Michael knew there was no other option. His thoughts raced as Sarah approached him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and understanding. "Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling, "what are you going to do?" Michael's heart felt like it was shattering. He had never wanted to put her in this position. He never wanted to put any of them through this. But now, he had to make a choice that would define who he was. There was no moral high ground, no perfect solution. It was raw, it was real, and it was about life or death. "I have to do something," Michael said, his voice barely audible. "I can't let them take her. I can't let them destroy everything we've built. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she took a step closer. But what if this changes you forever? What if you lose yourself in this fight? Michael felt his chest tighten. He had already lost so much. He had already lost pieces of himself in this fight, and he wasn't sure if he would ever be the same again. But Emily was everything. She was worth it. In that moment, Michael finally understood. The struggle wasn't just about saving his daughter. It was about saving himself, saving his humanity. He could feel the weight of that realization settle on his shoulders. He had to make the hardest decision of his life, and it would change him forever. But in the depths of that emotional turmoil, he found clarity. This was his moment, his life, his future, his family's future. It was all on the line. But the emotional high point wasn't just in the decision he had to make. It was in the struggle that would follow. The rawness of the pain, the fear, the love, the guilt. It all collided within him, making every second feel like an eternity. As Michael looked at Sarah, he knew that nothing would ever be the same. This wasn't just about saving his daughter. It was about reclaiming his soul from the darkness that had threatened to swallow him whole. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the battle ahead. No matter what came next, he was ready. The emotional weight of this moment was unbearable, but he couldn't let it stop him. He had to fight. For his daughter, for his family, for himself. The silence was deafening. The hours following Michael's decision felt like a never-ending blur of tension, guilt, and anticipation. He had thought the moment of action would bring clarity, but now, standing on the edge of the aftermath, the consequences of his choices were crashing down on him. As soon as he made the call to Robert, everything changed. The decision was swift, born out of desperation. He had been forced to play the game by Robert's rules, knowing that every moment of hesitation could cost Emily her life. The plan was in motion, and the inevitable consequences started to unfurl with brutal force. First, there was the shock of the physical toll it had on him. Michael had been prepared for the emotional weight, but the sheer exhaustion that gripped him after the decision hit harder than he anticipated. He hadn't realized how much of himself he had given to the cause until his body began to betray him. His muscles aching, his mind clouded with fatigue, and the hollow ache in his chest that wouldn't fade. Then there was the collateral damage to his relationships. Sarah, always by his side, now seemed distant, her eyes clouded with both worry and disappointment. She couldn't understand why he had made the decision to fight fire with fire. To her, it wasn't about saving Emily anymore. It was about crossing a line they could never return from. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and the emotional distance between them seemed to grow by the second. Michael could feel the strain in every conversation, every glance. The hardest consequence was yet to come. Despite all his effort, Emily was still in danger. Robert wasn't going to let this end with a simple exchange. He wasn't going to stop until Michael had been thoroughly broken. Michael realized that in trying to save his daughter, he had only put her deeper into harm's way. Robert's revenge was swift, calculated, and without mercy. The planned trade was a trap, one that left Michael and his team scrambling to cover their tracks. As he stood there, watching the scene unfold, he saw his worst nightmare come to life. Robert's men had gone beyond kidnapping. They were hunting Emily now, using her as leverage in a twisted game to break Michael mentally and emotionally. The final revelation came when the police arrived. A sting operation, set up long before Michael had made his decision, uncovered the full extent of Robert's criminal empire. It wasn't just about power or money. Robert had built his empire by manipulating and controlling people, playing off their weaknesses, preying on their fears. Michael was just the latest in a long line of victims. Robert had known Michael would make a move and had carefully orchestrated everything to create this moment of chaos. Michael's actions, intended to rescue his daughter, had now become a link in the chain that could unravel everything he held dear. His decision to confront Robert head-on had paradoxically left him exposed. The very tools he had thought would shield Emily from harm now laid bare the truth. He had underestimated the depths of Robert's cruelty. At the same time, Robert's own vulnerabilities began to surface. As the police closed in on his operation, it became clear that his once impenetrable facade was falling apart. Robert was no longer the untouchable mastermind. The consequences of his own manipulations were beginning to catch up with him. The two men, once on opposite sides of the law, were now bound by a shared fate. Their actions had set in motion a chain of events that neither could fully control. Michael, trying desperately to protect his family, had set the stage for Robert's exposure. The criminal kingpin's empire was crumbling as law enforcement zeroed in on his every move. The moment of truth arrived when Michael faced the consequences directly. Emily was found, but not before she had been scarred by Robert's games. In the end, it was clear that while Michael's actions had brought her back, they had also left a permanent mark on her and the family. The toll of the fight, the emotional scars, and the loss of innocence would haunt them all for years to come. Robert, once a mysterious and omnipotent figure in Michael's life, now found himself exposed in the light of his own mistakes. His carefully curated image, built on manipulation and fear, was shattered as the police uncovered the layers of his empire. He had long been a puppet master, pulling strings from the shadows, never expecting anyone to rise up against him. His confidence, built on years of control and deception, was beginning to crumble. His true motivation was more complex than Michael had ever imagined. Robert didn't just want power or wealth. He craved dominance, the ability to break people. He found pleasure in watching others falter, in seeing how far he could push before someone snapped. His empire wasn't just built on crime. It was built on human misery, on the broken spirits of those who had fallen victim to his cruelty. When Robert's empire began to fall apart, so did his mental state. The man who once thought he was untouchable was now a prisoner of his own ambition. His downfall was swift, but it was also a moment of clarity. Robert was forced to confront the very truth he had spent years avoiding: his own humanity, the vulnerability he had hidden under layers of cruelty. For the first time, he was just a man, not a god, not an untouchable force. As Robert was exposed, Michael saw the full scope of the damage Robert had inflicted on everyone he had ever encountered. Robert's motivations, his need to control, to destroy, became painfully clear, and Michael understood that he had been just another casualty in the grand scheme of Robert's sick game. In the end, Robert's exposure was not just the result of Michael's actions. It was the product of his own ego, his own overconfidence. He had underestimated his opponents, and in doing so, had set the stage for his own unraveling. As the walls closed in, Robert's carefully constructed life came crashing down. He had been the architect of his own destruction. As the weight of his decisions began to settle in, Michael was overwhelmed by a storm of conflicting emotions. The consequences of his actions were no longer abstract thoughts, but palpable realities that gnawed at him, leaving him in a state of deep internal conflict. What started as a clear-cut mission to save his daughter had turned into an emotional quagmire that threatened to swallow him whole. Guilt was the first emotion to flood his mind. The moment he had made the call to Robert, he had known there was a chance it could go wrong. But he had never anticipated it would spiral out of control like this. Emily had been put through hell, and the family too was now fractured beyond repair. His once clear sense of purpose was tainted by the thought that his actions had hurt the very people he had hoped to protect. The guilt gnawed at him, sinking its claws deeper with every passing second. He had always considered himself a protector, a man who could face any danger and do what was necessary to shield those he loved. But now, standing in the midst of the wreckage, Michael couldn't help but feel like a failure. His decision to confront Robert head-on, instead of relying on other methods, seemed short-sighted. He had acted rashly, driven by emotion and desperation, and the consequences were evident in the shattered pieces of his life. Anger followed closely behind the guilt. Anger toward himself for being so blinded by his desire to fix things that he hadn't considered the bigger picture. But there was also a simmering rage toward Robert. Robert had manipulated everything. Michael's choices, his desperation, even his own vulnerability. Michael's fury burned like a fire within him. And yet there was little he could do about it now. The villain was exposed, but it was too late to undo the damage. Robert had already won in the most twisted way imaginable. He had destroyed Michael from the inside. In the midst of this turmoil, fear began to creep in. Fear not for himself, but for Emily. He had fought so hard to bring her back, to rescue her from Robert's clutches. But now she was scarred in ways that would take years to heal. Fear that the damage to his family was irreversible, that the love and trust they once had would never return to its former state. Fear that even if he could somehow find a way to make amends, the pieces of his shattered world would never fit back together. But then there was a flicker of resolve. Amidst the turmoil, Michael realized that he had been changed. The man who had walked into this mess, hoping to save his daughter with swift action, was no longer the same person. The guilt, anger, and fear had pushed him to his limits, but they had also transformed him. He wasn't the naive man who believed everything could be solved with force or quick decisions. He was someone who had learned the hard way that every choice had consequences, and every action rippled outward, touching everything and everyone in its path. This transformation wasn't about victory or success. It was about survival. It was about facing his own limitations, acknowledging his mistakes, and trying to move forward, no matter how broken the path might seem. Michael stood there, emotionally raw, but stronger in his newfound understanding of the world around him. He wasn't perfect. He would never be. But he had learned a painful truth. The greatest battles were often the ones fought within. And that was the battle he needed to win now. As the dust settled and the chaos of the past few weeks began to dissipate, Michael found himself standing in the aftermath of the battle, reflecting on the resolution of his journey, the conflict that had consumed his life for so long, the desperate pursuit of justice for his daughter, the struggle against Robert's manipulation, and his own personal demons, was finally coming to an end. The moments of heartbreak, confusion, and uncertainty were behind him. And now, there was a path forward, though it wasn't the one he had initially imagined. Justice had been served, but not in the way Michael had anticipated. The moment he saw Robert handcuffed, taken away in the back of a police car, he didn't feel the satisfaction or triumph he expected. Instead, it felt like a hollow victory. Robert's manipulation had left deep scars on Michael's family, emotional wounds that couldn't be erased by a mere arrest. However, there was a certain level of relief in knowing that Robert was no longer a threat. The darkness that had loomed over their lives was finally lifting. But justice, Michael realized, wasn't just about putting away the bad guy. It was about restoring some semblance of peace, and that peace would come, not from revenge, but from healing. As for his daughter, Emily, the road to recovery was going to be long. The trauma she had endured would never fully fade, but the fact that she was safe, no longer in Robert's clutches, brought a sense of solace. Michael had failed in many ways throughout this journey, but in the end, he had fulfilled his ultimate goal. He had saved her. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was enough for now. Justice, in its truest form, was a complicated thing, he had learned. It wasn't about making things right in an instant. It was about moving forward, accepting what had happened, and working to rebuild from the ashes. The resolution of the conflict came with a quiet understanding that closure wasn't always about victory in the traditional sense. Sometimes it was about learning to live with the consequences, making peace with the past, and finding a way to move forward despite the scars. Michael had done his part in bringing Robert to justice, but now it was time for him and his family to heal, to rebuild their lives and rediscover a sense of normalcy, however different that might look. The emotional journey that Michael had undergone throughout the story was nothing short of transformative. When the conflict had first begun, he had been a man defined by his single-minded determination to save his daughter. He was impulsive, driven by raw emotion, and convinced that any sacrifice, no matter how extreme, was justified in the name of protecting his family. His confidence had been a shield, hiding the deep fears and vulnerabilities that lay beneath the surface. But as the story progressed, those fears and vulnerabilities had come to the forefront, forcing Michael to confront not just external threats, but his own internal struggles. The man who had entered this journey was consumed by anger, guilt, and confusion. But by the end of it, he had undergone a profound transformation. The emotional turmoil that had torn him apart had also reshaped him. He had learned that no decision came without consequence, and that the desire to control everything was ultimately destructive. The hero who had once sought to fight his way through every problem now stood as a man who understood the importance of patience, of healing, and of facing the complexity of human emotions. Where once Michael had been lost, drowning in his desperation to fix everything with a single decisive action, he had now become someone who recognized the value of quiet reflection, the power of forgiveness, and the need for compassion, not just for others, but for himself. He had been so focused on saving his daughter that he had forgotten to save himself, But now he could finally see the path to his own healing. He had come to understand that strength was not about fighting battles, but about confronting one's own fears and doubts and finding the courage to move forward, even in the face of uncertainty. The journey that Michael had undertaken was not just one of external struggle against an antagonist, but an internal struggle with his own emotions, flaws, and limitations. He had gone from a man blinded by rage and guilt to someone who was learning how to live with his mistakes and find a way to move forward. This final resolution was not just the conclusion of a story of family and justice. It was the completion of a man's personal evolution. Michael had gone from being a broken figure to someone who could begin the slow, painful process of healing, not just for his daughter, but for himself. In that quiet moment of understanding, standing amidst the wreckage, he found the first glimmer of hope, the first step toward redemption. His emotional arc had come full circle, from a man defined by fear and desperation to someone who understood that redemption came not through perfection, but through the acceptance of one's humanity. The man he had become was not flawless, but he was whole in a way that he had never been before. The sun began to set on the small town, casting a soft golden hue over the peaceful landscape. Michael stood at the edge of the park, his hand resting on the gate as he gazed out across the familiar scene. The place that had once felt so distant and alien, now a symbol of everything he had fought for. There was no dramatic change, no moment of sudden revelation. It was simply the quiet realization that life had moved forward, and so had he. In the weeks following the resolution of the conflict, Michael had found a sense of peace he never thought possible. His home, once a place of tension and fear, was now filled with the quiet sounds of everyday life. Laughter, the clinking of dishes, the soft hum of the television. Emily had begun to rebuild, her healing slow but steady. The scars of the past were still there, but they were no longer the defining marks of her existence. Michael had seen her smile more in the past month than he had in years. And, for the first time, he saw the light of hope in her eyes. It was enough to remind him that sometimes healing took time, and that was okay. Michael's journey had been one of immense struggle, but it was also one of personal growth. He had learned to accept the reality of what had happened, and while the pain would never fully disappear, he understood now that it wasn't about erasing the past. It was about finding a way to move forward, to honor the journey without being defined by it. As he stood in the park, watching the world continue on, Michael finally understood the importance of accepting his surroundings and the people in it. He no longer felt the need to fight every battle or carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Instead, he embraced the simplicity of the present, the love of his family, the peace he had fought so hard to find, and the understanding that life was fragile, but beautiful in its imperfection. The environment around him felt more like home now, a place where he could find the strength to move forward with his family by his side. It wasn't about achieving some grand, heroic victory. It was about the quiet moments, the everyday moments that truly mattered. His journey had taught him the importance of these moments, of cherishing the people he loved and accepting the ebb and flow of life as it came. Michael wasn't a perfect man, but in this final moment, standing under the fading light of the sun, he was finally at peace with who he had become. His past no longer defined him. He had shaped his future. And in that small, quiet moment, he was finally able to take a deep breath, knowing that despite everything he had survived, and so had his family. As the scene fades to black, the message lingers in the minds of the viewers. What would you have done in Michael's position? This powerful question leaves the audience reflecting on their own decisions, their own moral compass. Would they have fought as hard as Michael did to protect their family? Or would they have chosen a different path, one filled with more compromises, perhaps less struggle, but ultimately different consequences? The story has sparked deep introspection in every viewer, challenging them to consider what they would do when faced with a similar moral dilemma. But the journey doesn't have to end here. If you've been moved by Michael's story and the emotional depth of his journey, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more heart-wrenching tales and powerful life lessons. We want to hear from you. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Michael's journey did you relate to the most? What would you have done differently? Remember, this story is more than just fiction. It's a reflection of the choices we all make in our own lives. So, if you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, and join us as we continue to explore the powerful stories that connect us all. Your voice matters, so be sure to engage and share your thoughts. After all, stories like these are meant to spark conversation and reflection, and we can't wait to hear what you think.